A slashed tent, bodies in a creek, torn out tongues and crushed skulls. The demise of the Dyatlov group is the greatest mystery of the 20th century, one that has become overgrown with hundreds of myths, rockets, spies, maniacs. But reality turned out to be far harsher than any fantasy. Right now, you will find out how a single mistake turned a dream hike into an icy hell. You are on the Raccoon Chronicles channel, and today we will gaze into this abyss. Let's go. This is not a story about ghosts, nor about secret KGB missile tests, and certainly not about a visit from alien guests. This is a story about merciless cold, about the strict laws of physics, and about how a single, seemingly insignificant mistake can cost the lives of even the most experienced professionals when wild nature decides to show its unpredictable temper. It is January 1959. The Soviet Union is experiencing the era of the thaw and great hopes, a time when people sincerely believed that man was capable of conquering any peak, be it distant space or the harsh northern Urals. In Sverdlovsk, within the walls of the famous Ural Polytechnic Institute, a group of 10 people is being formed. And this is not just a company of students who decided to take a walk in the winter forest on a day off. This is a true elite, a kind of special forces of the hiking world of that time, behind whose shoulders were already hundreds of kilometers of impassable taiga, the most difficult crossings, and overnight stays on snow in bitter frosts. Their permanent leader is Igor Dyatlov, an ambitious 23-year-old guy with an iron will and unquestionable authority, whose aspirations lead him to the highest category of difficulty, because he wants to prove to everyone, and above all to himself, that for a Soviet hiker, nothing is impossible. Together with him on this hike go the best of the best. Zina Kolmogorova, the soul of the company, and a girl with a radiant smile with whom many guys in the hiking club were secretly in love. Rustem Slobodin, an incredibly enduring athlete whose legendary stamina was known to all. Yura Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonishenko, Sasha Kolevatov, the sharp-tongued Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Lyuda Dubinina. They were all young, strong, and full of life. The most mysterious member of the group was Semyon Zolotarev, a frontline veteran, a man much older than the others, who had gone through the war, whose sudden appearance in the established team still causes a heap of questions among researchers. But in that fateful hike, he became simply a reliable shoulder and an experienced comrade. Their main goal was Mount Otorten, the name of which in the Mansi language is often mistakenly translated as "don't go there," creating a mystical aura, although in reality, it is simply wind-swept mountain. But it was in that year that the wind there was not just strong, it was murderous, as if death itself was waiting for them on the slope. On January 23rd, they board the train, and laughter fills the car. Popular songs are played on the guitar, jokes flow like a river, and they take those famous black and white photographs in which they look absolutely happy and carefree, not even suspecting that these films will be developed by prosecutors, pulling frozen cameras from icy captivity. In the settlement of Vizhay, the last stronghold of civilization before the wild taiga, the first event occurs which can be called a true miracle and salvation. One of the participants, Yura Yudin, feels a sharp pain in his leg due to aggravated sciatica, which twists him so much that he physically cannot go further. He says goodbye to his friends, hugs them in parting, gives his warm fur vest to Sasha Kolevatov, and at this moment, he is upset to tears, thinking that he is a loser, missing the main adventure of the winter, completely unaware that this unbearable back pain has just gifted him his life. Yudin watches as the group on skis leaves into the forest, slowly dissolving into the white mist. And this is the last time anyone saw these 9 people alive. 9 future legends walking into eternity. The group moves along the bed of the frozen Lozva River. The frost gets stronger with every hour. The temperature drops to -25. The air rings with cold. But for them, this is a familiar environment. They walk clearly and smoothly, like a single mechanism, and Dyatlov leads the group with an iron hand, not letting them relax for a minute. On January 31st, they approach the foot of Mount Kholat Syakhl, which translates from Mansi as Dead Mountain, a creepy name that will subsequently become food for journalists and conspiracy theorists. But for the Dyatlov group, it was simply height 1079, another point on the map that needed to be overcome on the way to their main goal. On the morning of February 1st, the weather begins to deteriorate right before their eyes. The wind changes, becomes ragged, angry, and prickly, and the sky is covered with heavy leaden clouds that literally lie on their shoulders and press on the psyche with their blackness. They begin the ascent, but walking is incredibly difficult. Deep snow does not hold the skis. Backpacks weighing nearly 30 kilograms pull them to the ground, and every step turns into a struggle with gravity. So they cover very little ground and realize that they will not make it over the ridge before darkness falls. The wind on the pass gathers such force that it knocks them off their feet, blowing precious heat from under their windbreakers in mere seconds. Faces go numb, and eyelashes are instantly covered with thick frost. And it is here that Igor Dyatlov makes a decision that will become the starting point of their inevitable death. A logical, bold, and sporting decision. Instead of descending 1.5 kilometers down into the Auspia River Valley, where there is saving forest, firewood, and no wind, he commands to set up camp right here, on the bare slope, at altitude, in the piercing wind. This is called a cold overnight stay. Without a fire, without hot warmth, only the tent, sleeping bags, and the heat of human bodies. And perhaps he did not want to lose the height gained with such difficulty, or wanted to train the group in extreme conditions before the assault on Otorten. But this was a challenge they accepted without objection. Around 5 in the evening, when twilight thickens, turning the surrounding world into a gray murk, 9 people begin to prepare the place for the night. And this is where that fatal mistake is committed, which the physics of the mountain did not forgive. The slope is quite steep, with an incline of about 25 degrees, and to set up a long canvas tent sewn from 2 standard ones, they need a flat, horizontal platform. They take skis and ice axes and begin to literally cut into the snow, trimming the slope and biting into the snow mass, removing cubic meters of snow to create a depression, a kind of pit, in which the tent will be at least slightly protected from the furious wind. They work actively, warming themselves with movement. Steam pours from their mouths. Adrenaline plays in their blood. For the snow here is not soft and fluffy, but dense, wind-compressed crust, heavy as concrete, which they throw down in chunks, forming a protective wall. But they do not take into account one critical fact. The snow on the slope of Kholat Syakhl is a layer cake, where underneath lies loose, so-called depth hoar, slippery as ball bearings, and on top of it rests a heavy, dense slab of wind-blown snow. When they undercut the slope, they are, in essence, cutting the only support holding this heavy slab in place, violating the integrity of the snowboard, and creating colossal tension that is still holding on by a wing and a prayer, on friction and frost. But the clockwork mechanism of the catastrophe has already been launched. Above them, right above their heads, hangs a ton of deadly white mass, ready to break loose at any second, but they do not see it. The work is finished. The tent is set up. The water melted by breath on the canvas instantly freezes, turning the fabric into an icy shell, and they climb inside. 9 people in a cramped space where it immediately becomes warmer from breath, smelling of sweat, wet wool, and bread. They begin to change clothes, and this is an extremely important detail for understanding the subsequent horror. They take off their outer clothing, windbreakers, sweaters soaked with sweat, and, most importantly, they take off their boots, as heavy ski boots freeze into stone in the frost, and it is impossible to sleep in them, so they put them in the corner or use them as pillows, remaining in socks, ski tights, and light shirts. Their mood is fighting fit. We know this for sure, because they write in the general diary, with even handwriting, releasing a humorous wall newspaper, Evening Otorten, where they laugh at themselves, joke about love, and about the fact that the amount of rusks should be increased. Rustem Slobodin is possibly quietly playing a melody on the mandolin. If his frozen fingers still obey, they cut the brisket, take out rusks, and eat dry food, washing it down, probably, with melted snow, or the remains of cold cocoa from flasks. Outside, meanwhile, a real hell rages. The wind strengthens to hurricane values. Its speed reaches 30 meters per second. It howls like a wounded beast, furiously yanks the tent flaps, and covers it with fine ice grit that drums on the canvas like a sandblaster. Snow accumulates on the slope of the mountain, right above the cut edge of the pit. The pressure on the snow slab grows by the minute, because the wind drives more and more masses of snow. The tension in the layer reaches a critical point, and physics is implacable. Gravity pulls the slab down, while the force of adhesion weakens. Inside the tent, conversations and laughter gradually subside. They settle down to sleep with their heads toward the slope, feet down, closely pressed shoulder to shoulder, like herrings in a barrel, to save the precious heat of human bodies while outside the frost pushes past -30. Someone is already dozing, drifting into restless sleep. Someone listens to the eerie howling of the wind, thinking about tomorrow's difficult ascent. Dyatlov is surely running the route through his head, and Zolotarev is checking his camera. They do not know that these are their last minutes of peace. They do not know that the very pit they so diligently and professionally dug to save themselves from the wind has become their mass grave. They themselves, with their own hands, cocked the hammer of a giant snow gun, and nature has already placed its finger on the trigger. Inside is silence, outside is a roar, hearts beat evenly, but suddenly a crunch is heard, a barely audible dull sound coming from the depths of the mountain, as if a giant's bone has cracked. Then follows a shift, and that very second arrives, which forever divided their lives into before and after it has begun. The silence that reigned in the tent was deceptive and shaky, like the dead calm before an artillery raid, and unlike the storm roaring outside, here, inside, the deadly enemy crept up absolutely unnoticed, without a declaration of war, without a warning shot. Simply in one moment the world, which seemed to each of them protected by a thin layer of canvas, turned upside down. A sudden, dull blow, not ringing and sharp like a gunshot, but a heavy, womb-like rumble, as if the mountain itself sighed heavily and decided to lie on their chests, shook the slope, and in the same second, a ton of icy concrete collapsed onto the sleeping people. It was not that cinematic avalanche of fluffy snow that beautifully billows in clouds of dust and sweeps away everything in its path with the roar of an express train. No, reality turned out to be much scarier and more prosaic. It was a shift of the snow slab, that very wind-compressed hard plate, the integrity of which they themselves had violated during the day by cutting the slope to set up the tent. And now this giant mass, having lost adhesion to the base due to temperature changes and wind, slowly but with the inevitability of an asphalt paver crawled down, covering their fragile shelter. Darkness, instantaneous, viscous, and absolute, squeezed them in its grip. Air was knocked out of lungs at once. The tent canvas, which just a minute ago served as a roof, now became a shroud pressed to the face like a wet, icy gag, not allowing a breath to be taken. It was at this moment, in these first, most terrible seconds of chaos and panic, that the first serious injuries were sustained, over the nature of which experts and investigators would later rack their brains for decades. For no mysticism and aliens have anything to do with it, only implacable physics and strength of materials. The blow was powerful, crushing. Air was knocked out of lungs at once. The canvas, pressed to the face by wet snow, became a gag. In the darkness, in the confinement, under the weight of a ton of snow, they experienced the inhuman horror of being buried alive. Someone received severe bruises. Someone lost consciousness from the blow. But even through the shock and pain, the instinct of self-preservation screamed in the brain louder than any siren. "Get out! Immediately! Or death!" In the tent, which had become tight as a coffin, a real hell began. Someone screamed, but the sound drowned in the snow. Someone wheezed, trying to push the suffocating canvas away from their face, but the exit, that single saving exit which they had so carefully buttoned up, after all, there were no zippers on such tents back then, turned out to be tightly blocked by a ton of dense, packed snow. Breaking through it without a shovel was absolutely impossible. It was a dead end, a trap. And then the only available weapon remaining at hand went into action. A knife, an ordinary tourist finish knife, which in the pitch darkness by touch, someone's hand found. Perhaps Igor Dyatlov himself or someone who still retained the ability to act coolly. A sharp slash of the blade across the fabric, then a second, a third, the characteristic sound of tearing canvas, and through the formed long vertical gaps bursts not the long-awaited salvation, but a new, even more terrible enemy. Prickly snow flying horizontally, and a squall wind, which immediately blows away the remains of precious heat, chilling to the bone in a fraction of a second. They begin to literally tumble out, one after another, coughing, choking, in complete disorienting shock, pushing the wounded ahead of themselves, dragging by the arms those who lost consciousness or were stunned by the blow. And here they stand on the steep slope. And the picture that opened to them at that moment was more terrible than the worst nightmares. Around is the pitch darkness of the polar night, cut only by the dim beam of a single pocket flashlight. Someone managed to grab it in the turmoil. The wind knocks them off their feet. Its force is such that it is difficult to stand even for a healthy man. And among them are 3 seriously wounded, who barely stay on their legs and cough up blood. But the most terrible thing, the sentence they signed for themselves running out of the tent, is their appearance. They stand on the snow crust in socks, someone in one felt boot, someone barefoot altogether, in thin sweaters, without hats, without warm mittens, because everything, absolutely all vital equipment, including footwear, warm jackets, axes and saws, remained there under the thickness of snow, inside the flattened and torn tent. Attempts to dig out their belongings with bare hands in such wind, when fingers go numb and lose sensitivity in a couple of minutes, and the snow instantly cements from the frost, turned out to be completely fruitless. Furthermore, a wild animal fear of a second avalanche pulsed in their consciousness. They were afraid that the slope would slide again and bury them finally. It was at this very minute, when adrenaline was still seething in their blood, dulling the pain of injuries and not allowing them to fully feel the deadly horror of the cold in unprotected feet, that Dyatlov made his second, now unavoidable and fateful decision, the only one possible in that situation: to leave. To leave immediately down into the valley, to the saving forest, there where tall trees dampen the wind speed, where one can find dead wood, build a big fire and warm up, and in the morning, when it dawns and the storm subsides, return for the belongings and footwear. This was a chance, ghostly, weak, but still the only chance for life, as it seemed to them then, in the heat of the struggle. But they did not know, and could not know, that this path, only 1.5 kilometers long, barefoot on sharp, icy crust, at a temperature of -30 degrees, is no longer a path to salvation. It is an agonizing, heroic one-way road, a way of the cross that no one will survive. They lined up in a row, arm in arm, so as not to get lost in the darkness and blizzard, supporting the groaning from Payne, Zolotarev, and Thibault, and stepped into the white, roaring gloom, leaving behind the half-buried, slashed tent, which would forever become a monument to their carelessness and their incredible courage. They walked down, and the frost was already biting with 1,000 needles into their defenseless bodies, beginning its slow, methodical, and sure work of shutting down life, step by step, meter by meter, towards the old cedar, towards the ghostly fire, towards the cold eternity from which they would never emerge. Finally, when the slope became gentler, the silhouette of a huge Siberian cedar appeared before them, a mighty tree that was supposed to become their shelter, but became their monument. Under the spreading branches of the cedar, the wind was a little quieter, and here began a feverish, desperate struggle for fire, for they understood a simple truth. No fire means no life. But how to light a fire when your hands no longer obey the brain, when fingers do not bend and cannot even hold a match? Georgy Krivonishenko and Yura Doroshenko, who turned out to be in the lightest clothing, took this task upon themselves. They broke dry branches with bare hands, tearing skin. They tried to throw their whole bodies onto the boughs, shielding the weak flame with their bodies from the wind. And finally, they managed to create a small miracle. The fire caught, illuminating their faces distorted by suffering and hope. But this was not that hot pioneer bonfire they dreamed of. It was a pitiful, voracious little fire requiring constant fuel, and for its sake they had to do unbearable things. They climbed the cedar itself, clinging to the bark with frozen hands and feet, breaking thick boughs at a height of several meters, leaving pieces of their flesh and blood on the bark, which searchers would later find. The heat from the fire was weak. It burned the face and hands, but the back continued to freeze, and in this terrible contrast began the agony of the first victims. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, exhausted more than anyone, began to lose consciousness. Their bodies stopped fighting, and the brain, stupefied by hypothermia, plunged them into a sweet, deceptive sleep from which there is no awakening. They fell right near the fire, and a terrible thing happened. They received severe burns, their skin charred, but they did not even pull away their hands and feet because the deathly cold had already killed sensitivity. They burned without feeling pain, and quietly departed into eternity, one after another. The remaining 7 watched this with horror, but in an extreme situation there is no place for sentimentality. There is only the harsh law of survival. The dead no longer need clothes. The living need them to prolong their agony for at least an hour. And then, stepping over the moral barriers of the civilized world, the friends began to cut clothes from the bodies of their deceased comrades. Their fingers did not obey, so they used that very knife with which they cut the tent. They cut sweaters, took off pants, wound fabric around their icy feet, trying to create at least some insulation from the snow. But even this did not help. The fire was dying out. There was no more wood. Strength was melting away. And then the group made a decision to split up, realizing that sitting under the cedar meant simply waiting for death. Igor Dyatlov, Zina Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin, the strongest and most strong-willed, made a decision that can be called a suicidal feat. They decided to return back to the slope, to walk these 1.5 kilometers against the hurricane wind, to crawl up to the tent to get warm clothes from there and save the rest. It was an act of the highest courage and despair. They turned to face the wind, which hit them like a boxing glove, and crawled along their own track, biting into the snow with elbows and knees. Rustem Slobodin was the first to give up. He had received a head injury back when falling on the slope. His strength ran out just a few hundred meters from the cedar. He fell face down in the snow, and the heat of his body melted the ice under his face, forming a deathbed in which he would be found. Zina Kolmogorova, this unbending girl, went further than anyone. She fought to the last breath. She would be found in a pose of movement, as if she tried to get up and take one more step to save her friends, but her heart could not withstand the overload, and she froze, never reaching the goal. and Igor Dyatlov himself, the leader who felt responsibility for everyone, remained lying between them. He looked toward the tent which he himself had ordered to be set up at that fatal place. He hugged a birch tree as if saying goodbye to this world. His eyes were open, and in them froze a silent question to the sky, which that night was indifferent and black. Thus perished the first part of the group, those who tried to fight the elements in the open, who challenged the wind and lost, leaving their bodies on the slope as milestones on the path to immortality, while the 4 remaining at the cedar were still breathing, still clinging to life, preparing for their final act of tragedy in the deep ravine. While on the open, windswept slope, the life of Igor Dyatlov and his comrades was slowly fading. In the depths of the ravine, the last, most tragic and most confused act of this drama was unfolding, for the 4 remaining: Semyon Zolotarev, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, Alexander Kolevatov, and Lyudmila Dubinina were the most dressed and, as it seemed to them, the most protected in this situation, since they got the clothes cut from the deceased at the cedar. They understood that remaining in the wind meant dying, so they went deeper into the ravine, to where a creek flowed hidden under a thick layer of snow, and there, in relative calm, began to build their last shelter. With incredible persistence, working with already frostbitten hands, they constructed a flooring from cut tops of firs and spruces, trying to create at least some insulation from the cold ground. They laid out things in the corners, preparing to wait out this endless night and warming each other with body heat in the hope that in the morning the wind would subside and they could return to the tent. But fate, or rather to say, the merciless physics of winter mountains, prepared for them the most terrible blow, which subsequently gave birth to all these myths about stagings and special services. The fact is that by digging a cave in the snow over the creek, they, without knowing it themselves, undermined a multi-meter thickness of snowdrift, a giant snow cornice that hung over the ravine, holding on by a wing and a prayer. And at that moment, when they finally lay down on their flooring, perhaps even began to warm up and doze, this multi-ton cornice collapsed. It was not a fall of rocks. It was a blow by a soft but monstrously heavy mass, which instantly compressed their bodies against the hard bottom of the creek and stones, and it is precisely this that explains those terrible injuries incompatible with life that so frightened the pathologists. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotarev had broken ribs, moreover broken multiply and symmetrically. The chest was literally crushed, and Nikolai Thibault Brignol had a severe depressed skull fracture. It is important to understand that there were no external hematomas or abrasions characteristic of a fight or beating on their bodies. The skin remained intact, which confirms the version of crushing by a huge mass of snow, and not an attack by people or beasts. Death for some came instantly. Kolevatov perhaps remained alive longer than anyone. He pressed Thibault to himself, trying to warm his already dead friend, but breaking out from under the thickness of snow, being wounded in the dark, in the creek that began to wash them from below, was impossible. They remained lying there, in this icy crypt, hidden from human eyes for long 3 months, while their comrades on the slope were already being buried in closed coffins. When in May, when the snow melted, searchers finally found their bodies in the creek, the picture was truly shocking and gave birth to the darkest rumors. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing eyes and tongue. Zolotarev also had no eyes. But there is no mysticism, no ritual murders or torture here. There's only the harsh truth of nature. The bodies lay face down in the running water of the creek for more than 90 days, and the water, as well as small inhabitants of the creek, mice, larvae, and microorganisms, did their job, for soft facial tissues always decompose first. This is the law of forensic medical examination, and not a trace of aliens. The strange skin color, which was called orange or brick red, was a consequence of ordinary sunburn, as they lay in the sun for several days after the snow melted before they were found, and the natural process of decomposition and traces of radiation on clothes, about which so much was said, turned out to be negligibly small and were explained by the fact that Krivonishenko worked at the closed nuclear facility, Mayak, and simply poorly washed his sweater from production dirt even before the hike. Thus the circle closed, and the story of the Dyatlov group is not a detective story with chases. It is a tragedy about courage and the impossibility of defeating the elements when they fly into a rage. 9 young, strong, talented people died not at the hands of spies, but from a confluence of fatal circumstances: a cold front, an erroneous decision to undercut the slope, a shift of the snow slab, and a subsequent chain of heroic but doomed attempts to save each other. They did not abandon the wounded. They shared the last clothing. They fought to the last heartbeat. And precisely in this lies their feat, which does not need invented monsters. For the most terrible monster is the indifferent, inhuman cold, which that night on the dead mountain took them all, leaving us only memory, questions, and an eternal lesson on how fragile human life is in the face of eternity. Thus ended their hike, not on the summit of Otorten, but in an icy creek, in total darkness. But their struggle for life deserves respect more than any fairy tales about aliens. And what do you think? Could the group have been saved if they hadn't split up? Write your opinion in the comments, and remember, nature does not forgive mistakes, but it also teaches us to value life. See you soon.